Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, November 8th. And I want to start by talking about a headline I saw just the other day that said, the German government collapses. And I was like, this sounds pretty extreme. So can you tell me what's happening here?
Yeah, it's uh, the German coalition government that's been in power for the last couple of years. Um, is it's actually known as the traffic light coalition. I guess there are three parties that make up the coalition. One is the Green Party. That's obviously the green light. The other is the Social Democrats. I think that's probably the red light. And then there's the third one, which is the Freedom Democratic Party. And never heard much about them. Olaf Scholz is a social democrat. He's the chancellor. And then Elena Baerbock, the idiotic. They're all idiots. But maybe Baerbock takes the cake. She's a foreign minister. And then the minister of economics is his name escapes me right now. But he's also a member of the Greens. So there have always been strains because these parties are ideologically dissimilar. And I think maybe you can say especially the Freedom Democrats. And it was the Freedom Democrats that left the coalition and have brought about the collapse that you're talking about. Um, they are fiscal conservatives, unlike the other two. And Germany is a fiscally conservative country. They've been very careful about, restraining their spending. They're very averse to debt and to deficits. And the Freedom Democrats are part of that. So they're well within the German, fiscal tradition. What happened, of course, was the hyperinflation in the 1920s. That's something that's seared into the German memory, and they swore never again. We're not going to risk that. Um, so they have kept their debts and deficits under control. Now, I guess what happened was that um, the Olaf Scholz and the Green Party were um, trying to borrow a large amount of money for Ukraine, and and I think it's Christopher Lind. I'm not sure about that. Linden. I'm not sure. I'm terrible with names, but it was the head of the Freedom Democrats that refused. He said, we don't. That's money we don't have, and um, apparently he said, I've seen at least in one report, you say, well, don't send him money. Why don't you just send him the Taurus missiles? And then Olaf Scholz, to his credit, said, no, we're not doing that. Again, this is something that he's remained firm on. And it seems clear that this is, we've said that there don't seem to be any red lines um, that the Europeans and the Americans won't cross. This does appear to be a red line that they won't cross. So, sending long range missiles that could strike deep into Russia. And the Taurus is one of those. It has a range of 500 kilometers. But that's kind of tangential to this. But the thing was, it was a budget issue. And the Freedom Democrats refused to go along. And so they said, well, then we don't want you. That's what the Social Democrats and the Greens said. And so, okay, he packed up his bags and left. The whole party um, withdrew from the coalition. And without them, they don't have, enough people to govern Germany. So they're going to have to hold elections. I believe the elections will be held in January.
Like, did this have anything to do with Trump winning the presidency? Because it seems like it happened right after the election, right? That this collapse happened. So is there some type of tie there?
Well, people have speculated as to that, and some people argue that it does have something to do with the election. Um, one of the ideas that was put forward was that, like Olaf Scholz and Baerbock and the rest of them they hate Trump so much that they can't bear the thought of actually having to cooperate with him. I don't think so. I don't think it really had anything to do with Trump. There were strains already, and the fiscal issue is a real issue, right? I mean, that's something it's always been there, and we've heard about it. I think like a couple months ago, we're hearing that some about arguments over the budget, And
Right.
I think again the Freedom Democrats just remained firm, and so the coalition just fell apart.
Right. Well, I mean, the budget is tied to the Ukraine project as well. The
Yeah, so it
German
is.
government was
It
asking.
Right, exactly. So it is very much linked to Ukraine. There's no question about it. Now they're all, virulent Russophobes. They're all, very fervent supporters of Ukraine, including the Freedom Democrats. But the Freedom Democrats are fiscal conservatives on top of that, and they won't abandon those principles for the sake of Ukraine.
Right. Well, I mean, Trump has really voiced his displeasure with the Ukraine Russia war and talks
Yeah,
about wanting to end it. We talked about whether how possible that is, but definitely it seems to have taken the wind out of the sails of a lot of the European politicians that want this war to continue.
right.
So do you think that's having repercussions, shockwaves through the EU
Yeah, well,
in
there
regards to
clearly
this war?
is. I mean, there's a great deal of fear and loathing within in Europe. But I remember that back in 2016, and their fears were not realized. None of them were. There was a fear that he would bring about the end of NATO, which would have been a wonderful thing. I think that was a good reason to support Trump. He said that what's the point of NATO, and he was right, right? But when he took power, he expanded NATO. He made it stronger than ever. And so all the fears that the Europeans had about that were completely unjustified. And I'm afraid I'm a cynic on this. I'm afraid that their hysteria and all the fears that they're expressing now, that all of that's going to be gone in a year or so. When Trump puts together a team that's just like the old team, and that the same old policies remain in place. I think that
Really that cynical?
I am that
You're,
cynical. Okay,
I
I'm not
mean,
100% sure. I've said there because there clearly are some people within his inner circle who really understand what's going on in Ukraine and do want to bring an end to it. But there are others who are, that are like Mike Pompeo, for example, or our South Carolinian friend
Lindsey Graham.
Lindsey Graham, right? I mean, these people, there's nobody's worse than them, and he's also buddying, up with them, and sometimes he says things that reflects their. So you just don't know with Trump, and I'm afraid, just based on past experience, that he'll just go with the same old people. Again, I'll be very happy. There's a chance, I admit, there's a real chance that we'll get a significant change of course. There's a chance of that, whereas there was no chance with Harris. But I think still the odds, the smart money is on the deep state winning the battle and maintaining the course. So I
I'll
think
put
the
money on
Europeans
that.
are going to, in the end, their fears are unjustified. I think they'll prove to be unjustified. They'll get the same old thing. But the one thing that will remain constant is they personally detest the man. They really dislike him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like it's different this time around because Trump and JD Vance have both really expressed their displeasure of sending all this money to Ukraine, and that's a big part of their platform. Is to end this war. So I'm less cynical than you are.
Mm-hmm.
So we can make a little
Okay.
side
Well, I
bet
hope
later after the
I
show.
hope you're right. That's all I can say. I hope you're right.
Do you think people like Lloyd Austin want this war? Do you think that he's somebody that is supportive of this conflict,
I'm
or
not
is this
sure. That's a good question. Again, we've talked about this, how, the realists, at least in relative terms, we find them within the military establishments, whether we're talking about Israel or the U.S. And yeah, the Pentagon I think, it's always shown more realism. Recently we had that fight. It was Blinken was trying to get the restrictions on long-range missiles lifted. And he teamed up actually with Keir Starmer of the UK and went off, and they thought they were going to be able to persuade Biden. But the Pentagon remained firm. They just said no is no, and they wouldn't budge. So again, that's good news. And it's because it's their job to fight wars. They really understand better what war is all about. You have a lot of the civilians just have a kind of a romantic view of war, and they think it's just about simply willpower and whatever, and they but the military people understand the nuts and bolts of what's going on, so they know that there are hard limits to what they can do. So yeah, I remember at the beginning of the conflict, Lloyd Austin was clearly very much on board, and he in fact went out and said that this war is about weakening Russia. But now, in recent months, we've been getting reports that Russia is stronger than ever, and I think he's probably aware of it. So I think like of all the government agencies that might be difficult to persuade, or well, the one that would be easiest to persuade to reach some kind of agreement with the Russians probably would be the Pentagon. I think you would have much more trouble, dealing with the State Department, for example. I mean, that's where you get the foaming at the mouth ideologues. Right. But I don't want to exaggerate the realism. I think there is a lot of, even within the Pentagon, there's a lot of wishful thinking. There's a lot of bad intelligence. It's just not as bad as in other departments.
Yeah. Yeah, you think they have to know. I mean, it's kind of like having a big prize fight and you have your champ, and then you're just watching your fighter go 5 rounds and just get the crap beat out of him, and you just don't want it to keep on going because it's just humiliating for the United States. The longer that this goes on, it just makes us weaker and weaker. So, I mean, if I was Lloyd Austin and you want to call the fight now, try to save as much face as you can, especially when you have all these tensions currently in the Middle East and, rising tensions with China and Taiwan as well. It just, I just think Lloyd Austin has to realize over the past 2 years that, hey, this isn't working. We've really given a lot, just looking at the nuts and bolts of it. So I just feel like there has to be,
the Pentagon to be willing. Right. I mean, recently, just to support that, I think it was maybe 2 months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, that the Pentagon actually said quite openly, sorry, but we don't even have any more ATACMS missiles for Iran, not for Iran, but rather for Ukraine. We only have so much, and we can't spare any more. I mean, they just said that outright. There's all this talk, why don't you send in the ATACMS and lift the restrictions? The restrictions aside, we don't even have them, he said. We just don't have any to spare. And I mean, the Pentagon knows what's in their warehouses, what they have and what they don't have.
Right. Right. I mean, Lloyd Austin has to follow the commander-in-chief, right? And these are political ideologues that are all about expanding and preserving Western hegemony. And then, I mean, just think there could be a possibility that Lloyd Austin might be relieved when someone like Trump comes into power to say, okay, maybe I can work with this guy to call the fight because he isn't the same political ideologue when it comes to this. So you might have the Pentagon in your camp talking, if Trump is talking to Lloyd Austin and the Pentagon generals and realizing, and obviously J.D. Vance is aware of the situation. He wrote that piece that was just saying that this mathematically doesn't make sense, that the U.S. just is not able to produce the munitions, that this war is exposing the weakness of the U.S. military. It's damaging the United States and it's strengthening Russia. He seems to understand that very well. So I just feel like that there's a good chance that both people like Trump and J.D. Vance will have a Pentagon that will be receptive to ending this conflict. Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, again, I think the Pentagon is probably very receptive to ending the Ukraine conflict. I think there's no question about it. Again, much more than other agencies like certainly the State Department, probably the CIA and the DIA as well. But let's just hope that Trump picks a reasonable Secretary of Defense. Lloyd Austin probably is not going to be there when Trump is inaugurated. And the name that's being floated as the most likely candidate, the most likely future Secretary of Defense is none other than Mike Pompeo. And that would just be a disaster. I think he would be worse than Lloyd Austin.
Oh, why? Do you really think that?
Yeah, I certainly.
Well, where is it?
If he does that, then I just say it's over. Clearly nothing has been learned. It's the same old thing. Let's just hope. Other people have hoped against hope that he could choose somebody like Colonel Douglas McGregor. That would be
I was
great.
going
If
to
that
say, I was
happens,
going to
yeah,
say,
we'll have a huge
yeah,
party, and I'll very gladly admit that my cynicism was entirely misplaced and whatever, and we'll celebrate. But
yeah. Fingers crossed,
unfortunately, I
Colonel
think
Douglas
it's more
McGregor.
likely going to be Pompeo. Much more likely that it'll be Pompeo than it will be Douglas McGregor.
Mm, okay,
But at
well,
least, yeah.
well,
But the
one,
thing is, like Douglas McGregor, he's I think sort of like on the periphery of the Trump team. They're people there who talk to him. I mean, that's again, it does give you a little bit of hope. I just I'm
when
the
will we
cynic.
know? When do
Well,
those
it could be
appoint?
any
Will
time.
those?
There's really no. The only time limit is January 20th, but he could declare appointments at any time between now and then. It could be tomorrow, but it more likely will be a month or two from now.
Okay, well, I hope he does it sooner rather than later. Before there's always a risk that the deep state tries to take him out again or something, and then we get Mike Pompeo or John Bolton back in there. Um, well, something else that yeah, I mean, it seems that the current administration is afraid about aid being cut to Ukraine. It sounds like Biden is trying to rush a last minute aid package to
Hmm.
Ukraine of $6 billion to keep it going. So, do you think that Trump really will? That's the question we kind of been talking about. That he will just cut that aid because it seems like there's that fear within Europe and even the current administration. So they're doing everything they can to try to make sure this conflict
Yeah,
keeps going
right.
now, trying to
Right.
gather up the
Yeah, it's
money.
not impossible. Again, I'll just say it's not impossible. I mean, it's much more believable that aid will be cut to Ukraine. Again, I think in good part because it would be a politically popular measure here in the U.S. Certainly the Republican base and much more, just probably a majority of Americans would support cutting aid to Ukraine. They feel like the money should not be spent. No more money should be spent there. It should be spent within the U.S., which is very reasonable, right? So it would be politically popular. Of course, it's something that our permanent bureaucracy will fight tooth and nail. Quite the fact that something's popular doesn't mean that it gets passed. Unfortunately, we don't really have a very healthy democracy in that sense. It's those powerful interests usually get to decide things and not popular opinion. But there is always a chance that it will happen. There certainly is. In any case, like the $6 billion, I think is pretty meaningless because, again, it's what the U.S. can give Ukraine is very limited. Is now they've gone through the stockpiles, and now it's just monthly production figures, and they only have so much, like so many artillery shells. They can give them so many interceptors, and those are very limited quantities. So many, infantry fighting vehicles. And that's just not going to change. It's the 6 billion is really doesn't mean very much. I mean, I think that it's more symbolic than anything else.
Right, some kind of moral support to keep the Kiev
Hmm.
regime going. But if the money stops, then that Kiev regime will collapse, right? You mentioned in the last podcast that you think that there might be a frozen conflict, but then I really
No,
don't think that.
no. Actually, I don't think there will be a frozen conflict. That's
Okay,
not going to happen.
I was
That's
I was
something
saying
that,
that I
like,
don't.
that's what Those are the proposals that are being discussed, within the West. And but Russia has made it clear again and again and again. They have made it crystal clear that they're not going to accept that. So it's just I don't even know why they're discussing it over here. Why Trump is? I mean, that's basically his idea too. It's
Right.
Putin, is going to say
I
no.
was that's a pipe dream. I was about to say
Right.
there's no way that
Right.
Russia's in the driver's seat. While they don't want a frozen conflict, they get it called a shot. So if aid stops going to Ukraine, basically it just means that Russia is going to quickly march to Kiev. There'll probably be some type of unrest in Ukraine when they realize that all of a sudden the money dries up and you're not being able to pay everybody to keep this war going.
Yeah.
I think it'll pretty much end right there on its own. They will depose. Zelensky will be deposed, and a new Ukrainian government will be elected. And Russia will ensure that that government is one that will ensure neutrality and will agree never to join NATO.
Uh-huh.
And then that will be that. And I don't. Of course, we will. The real pressure I feel is just all the media and our politicians will talk about how this is such a tragedy and how we let Ukraine fall to Russia. when really Russia's not even taking it. They just want this, the security interest of
Right.
Russia to be considered.
Right. Again, they
Neutrality,
right at
no
the start,
NATO.
they offered to give up all the territory. Remember back in March of 2022. Okay, let's sign this Istanbul agreement. We'll just pull out. Okay, you keep the Donbass. That's what they offered. They say we don't want the territory. We want the neutrality, and we want to see your Banderite, ultra nationalists gone, and they're virulent, anti-Russian policies. We want to see protection for Russians within your country. That's what they were asking for, and it would have been so smart, for in fact there are a lot of Russians who were quite upset about it. You're giving away too much, right? You can't trust these people. It would have been very, very much to the Ukrainians' advantage if they had taken that deal. Of course, it would be so much better off, but they didn't take it. And
Well, the other thing is just the idea of making a deal with Russia, the West making a deal with Russia, I think is also just ludicrous to think that Russia would consider even negotiating with the West after everything that has
yeah,
been happened since
right,
2014. They just realize that we can't trust these guys at all.
right,
Even if
right.
Trump says something, then it doesn't really matter. The deep
Uh-huh.
state might change or a new president will come in power. We're all back. So I think there is not really going to be any negotiations. I mean, maybe there'll be some dialogue and some attempt, but I think the reality is
Hmm.
that Russia doesn't trust the United States anymore, and for good reason. And Russia holds all the cards, so they're going to call the
Right,
shots. And the
right.
smart move will just be to pull out, end the bloodshed now,
Cut off the
and really
funds. Yeah.
right, really the danger I think that we have is just how the propaganda machine is going to use this as an attack vector on Trump, constantly to say look how we abandoned our
Hmm.
ally and we're destroying NATO, and now Russia's going to roll into Poland
Hmm.
and through the Balkans, and
Yeah, yeah.
that's what we're going to hear. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to not keep it going, when reality the safe thing and the secure thing and the right thing to do is just to pull out completely, let Ukraine be neutral, not enter NATO, and then we have this buffer zone, and we can go back to having restoring relations with Russia. Obviously, that's the right one, but this Russia phobia is so extreme that I think that's the real battle that we have to counter. That
Hmm.
hopefully we can see how that plays out in the future. Um, Okay, well, one other thing just about the Ukraine conflict is I saw a CBS News headline this morning. It said, North Korean troops in Russian uniforms moving towards Ukraine, Pentagon says. And so
Yeah,
when
yeah,
we talked about the North Korea saga before, you said, well, at least the Pentagon is being realistic and saying,
yeah.
okay, yeah, of course, there are North Korean troops there, but they're not going to Ukraine. Well, this CBS News headline says you're wrong. The
Okay.
Pentagon is
Yeah.
now saying this. So.
Okay. I haven't actually read that story. Uh, uh, Now, there's a possibility that the headline is misleading. I think there's a very strong possibility. Sometimes I see headlines like that and I start to read it, and then you get somewhere down in there and say, okay, yeah, there are, yeah, they appear to be, or we have some intelligence that suggests that they might be, heading to in Russian uniforms and heading to Ukraine. I don't know. Maybe you look in that and actually maybe in fact the Pentagon made that firm statement. I'm not saying that the Pentagon always tells the truth. Obviously they don't, and they do
Yeah.
take
To
part in
be honest, I
propaganda.
just saw
Yeah,
the headline right before. I didn't actually read the article. Just right before
yeah,
the
yeah.
podcast,
But
I
I
saw
found that
So
often headlines are misleading. It's clickbait. And usually the claims, like when you get into the body of the article, usually not always. This may be actually reflective of the reality, but usually you'll find that it's not quite what the headline claimed it to be. It doesn't matter if the Pentagon said that, and they're just they've drunk the Kool-Aid with the rest of them, and they're just gone. They've joined this really bizarre collective delusion about North Koreans being sent to the front lines to fight the Ukrainians. I just find the whole thing is just very amusing. This really bizarre. I keep on expecting it to kind of eventually it'll fizzle out, I'm sure, but it has more legs than any lie that I've seen in a long time, and it's become very elaborate. I think a couple days ago. Zelensky claimed that, the first clash between Ukrainian soldiers and North Korean soldiers had occurred, and that 11 North Koreans had been killed. I just listened to a speech of his this morning. He gave it somewhere in Europe, but he was claiming, that Europe must stand united, not just against Putin, but against Kim Jong-un. We cannot, the only thing that the two of them understand. So it's now, where is force and, is our united resolve. The whole thing was so bizarre, and you see all these kind of blank faces around him. And I'm wondering if anybody actually believes him. Probably a few of them do, but the whole thing is so weird. It's just really silly.
Well, do they provide any evidence?
No,
Or is this
no. They just have not. And even like when some of it is it's just Zelensky. Like when Zelensky claimed that 11 North Korean soldiers were killed, not even a single Ukrainian channel, had made that claim. It was just him. I think he made it up on the spot. It's really funny. It becomes, the whole fantasy has become very elaborate. There was something about, North Korean soldiers have become addicted to pornography because it's the first exposure to the internet. And, that was Reuters, again, a reputable. But then later, actually, somebody asked the Pentagon directly about it and said, well, we don't have any information to support that.
Well, right. I was about to say, who's checking that? How can
That was just so bizarre. Yeah, another thing is that, that they're, the North Korean soldiers are malnourished and poorly trained and whatever, it's such an elaborate lie that it really kind of takes my breath away. I mean, and sometimes you stop to think, well, maybe there's something to it. I don't think there's anything to it. There just hasn't been an iota of evidence. And the whole thing is just really silly. I mean, the fact that there are North Korean soldiers that they're there, we know, again, from your sister is an eyewitness of that. But there's nothing strange about that. That's completely to be expected. They're close allies. And they come, I think they just came for training. And they may go close to the front line, so it would make perfect sense. They can observe how logistics are done, how the equipment is repaired, and all that kind of thing. But there's just no reason for them to join the fight. There's no reason whatsoever. It would be very much to the detriment of the Russian effort there.
So all these rumors that are being posted on CBS News and Reuters, they're just coming straight from Zelensky himself without
basically.
And no verification, no evidence, just whatever.
Well, I think this is all symptomatic of a real problem now in Western media. That is, it used to be like back in the old days when I was growing up, and we relied on newspapers and a few, news networks like CBS, ABC, NBC. That was basically it. That these newspapers and TV networks, they had large foreign news staffs. Like they might have a dozen people just for the Soviet Union back then. And then these were people who could speak Russian and spent a lot of time in Russia. I remember reading a book by one of them. He was a New York Times correspondent, Hedrick Smith. He wrote a book, The Russians, which I found fascinating. He really understood the place. These are people that lived there and knew what they were talking about. And that's where we got our news from. There's always been a certain amount of shaping, of narratives and whatever. But back then you actually had, real intelligent people gathering real information. And I think we had a much better understanding of what was actually going on in other countries, especially countries that were hostile to us. We actually had people there who were trying to understand how those people lived and thought. Those international or those foreign news staffs have just been completely gutted. Like in the case of some of the news networks, they don't have anybody. They have nobody. I think like maybe the New York Times maybe has a couple guys in all of Russia now, but some of these news like CNN, what I was just hearing the other day is they don't have anyone. So what do? They just let the Ukrainians tell them whatever they're supposed to believe. So that's why we're getting these crazy stories. is that we're just, essentially it's just being fed to us directly by Ukrainian propagandists. Or in the case of Israel, just directly by, Israeli Zionist propagandists with no filter whatsoever. I think it was always much more of a problem in Israel because, unfortunately, a lot of the reporters that we sent over there were Zionists themselves. That was very true of the New York Times, that a lot of them were Jewish Zionists. And so you didn't really get any kind of balance. I think it was better than it is now, but there was always a problem in Israel. But in places like Russia, you really did get a lot of the truth. But we don't now. We just don't have people there collecting real information, people who actually understand the country. We just don't. So we get these crazy stories.
Well, it's not like that they can't do it. There are plenty of Americans living in Russia if they want to interview them or find,
right.
why do they just not even care about the truth anymore? That the mainstream media is just completely.
That's certainly part of it. I think we're looking at, there's certainly this ideology. We've become a much more highly ideological society, or at least our ruling elite is. We used to have people who were much more practical and firmly grounded in reality in charge, and now we have these increasingly unhinged, ideologues, these neocons. So that's certainly part of it, but I think it's also a question of economics. It's just like in the old days. If you wanted to get international news, you really depended on these sources. So a newspaper like the New York Times could actually afford, and made economic sense for them to have a dozen, highly trained journalists in the Soviet Union, because they were one of the few information gathering organizations, and people were willing to pay for them to do their job. But now, all these newspapers and also major TV networks have been undercut by the internet. And, how do we get our information? I get it from Telegram channels and from Twitter and from a myriad of sources, but very little, it's some from the mainstream news sources. But I just find that's, there's less value in that. There's just ways there's no need to pay for a subscription to the New York Times or the Financial Times or anything. You can get your information, through other sources. And so they just, they could not justify maintaining these large staffs of foreign news correspondents.
Yeah, well, if they told the truth, then I think it would be popular. I mean, from
an
economic point of view.
Yeah. No,
I mean, look at
right.
Tucker Carlson was by far the most popular person on news. And he was fired because it wasn't an economic decision. It was an ideological decision.
That's very, very true. That's very true.
So I think the economics are actually in favor of telling the truth because people want the truth. It resonates when the truth is told. I mean, that's why these people are going to alternative sources, dissident news sources. We're just a very small channel, but just like we're a little example. The reason that we're able to slowly build a little bit of a following is because we're not just spouting propaganda from Ukraine. We're actually trying to ask real questions and understand it objectively. And if the New York Times did that, if CNN did that, I guarantee you the ratings will go up and they'll start making more money. So it's completely, in my opinion, it's not just about the internet has undercut them and they have to resort to crappy clickbait titles because to stay relevant. It's the fact that they are just ideologues now. All mainstream media seems to be run by ideologues. I mean, why did Fox News get rid of Tucker Carlson?
Right.
Who's obviously the number one show in all.
Right.
Right, exactly. So it was just because he was talking about Ukraine in a more objective way.
Right.
So who's making that shot? So is it just? I think that's just proof that the deep state, the administrative bureaucracy of the United States, the foreign policy bureaucracy, controls the media. I think that's fair to say now. There's no.
Yeah.
Did you? I mean,
well,
do you
I think
agree?
it's a seamless garment. I mean, it's just like the thing is they're basically the same people. You know, they're people that have graduated from the same colleges. Some of them went into these media organizations, some of them went into government, but they're basically the same people. And the friendships and family relations and whatever are just across the line. There's really no line to speak of. There's really no.
It's the revolving door.
Yeah, and so they look at the world with the same mind. So it doesn't really. It's not really necessary for the deep state to issue instructions. They all think the same way.
Okay, well, hopefully they lose power as more and more people realize that this is just narrative,
Right.
mind control,
Right. Now,
propaganda.
well, another thing that I wanted to point out too is that these these newspapers and TV networks, they have also become captured in a way by their own audiences. That's the other part of it, is that they okay, yeah, they're all part of the establishment, but then the people that watch them are also part of that establishment. They have the same mind, and they expect to get a certain kind of news. And when actually, like the New York Times, you're saying, well, they should start speaking the truth. I think in the long run, it would be to their advantage. But in the short run, they're going to lose a lot of readers. That's what's happened. Like recently, what was it? The Washington Post chose not to endorse a Democratic candidate. And they immediately lost 800,000 subscribers, which just seems to me bizarre. I mean, it's not even anything about like the veracity or the objectivity of your of the news that you provide. Just that your failure to go out and advocate for a candidate means that I'm not going to read your paper anymore. But 800,000 did that, so it shows like that's kind of what they've really kind of painted themselves, well, not exactly painted themselves into a corner, but they got themselves into a real fix. They have become ideological, and now they're really tied to that ideology in a lot of different ways, not just to the establishment, the government above them, but also to their own readers and and viewers.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that they have become captured by their own audience. They need to keep on feeding them. It's a dangerous situation, I think, for society, where that's become polarized, that there's so many people that need to be fed this story, this narrative. Even it's a false story, false narrative, but they have built their identity on it for so long that they need that lifeblood of Russia, terrible, bad. We need to keep on hearing that. Trump is Hitler. If they stop being fed that, they'll feel like their whole identity, they have an identity crisis. They start to break down. Yeah. But it has to, right? I mean, will people stay in that mindset forever? I mean, how do you break
obviously
people
not
out
for
of it?
not forever, but they could stay there for a long time. I think actually Matt Taibbi has written some very interesting articles on this polarization within the media. And the point he makes is that, again, back when I was a kid and there were just these few major news sources, each of these media outlets, their main incentive was actually try to capture as much of the general audience as possible. So you're trying to get the broad center. So there was some pretty powerful incentives not to become too biased in one direction or another. Now, I think there's no question that there was a liberal bias. I mean, it's slightly to the left, but it wasn't radically to the left. And they did journalistic ethics require them to present the other side, and they didn't always do that fairly, especially on certain issues. But in general, there was that tendency. And so you had all kinds of people sitting down and watching the news. Like my grandfather, on my mother's side, he was a conservative Republican, but he would sit down and he would watch, the national news every night. And sometimes he would criticize what he perceived to be liberal bias. But then my parents, who were, Berkeley liberals, they sit down and they watch the same news. And and so everybody was getting it from the same source. And it was generally, there's no such thing as true objectivity. And I think there really was a liberal bias, but it was much more objective, and I think it was much closer to reality. than what we have now. But now we have these ideological bubbles, and it's just like they've broken apart. So it's just like, MSNBC, they know who their audience is, and if they deviate from it, they get in trouble. They have to stay very firmly in we'll say, the woke progressive camp. And then Fox News, again, is establishment conservative. Is what it is. Obviously they actually, we had somebody there, Tucker Carlson, that was going to go farther. So there are limits to what these mainstreams will do. I think all of them are constrained to some extent. Clearly, Fox News too, by the establishment. But they do not go, to the broad center the way that they used to. They certainly do not do that.
Right. No, it's that state of affairs that it's true. When I hear somebody like, oh, like, yeah, I watch MSNBC, I immediately know, okay, I know what false narrative you're now following.
Right.
Somebody says that, oh yeah, I listen to Fox. I'm like, oh, I know what false narrative you're following there. You got Lindsey Graham on there every night saying, bomb Iran. We got to do everything to defeat these terrorists, and then you turn on it. MSNBC, it's just how Putin's going to be rolling into the rest of Europe. Right. It's just.
Yeah, and actually, you'll find some of both. They have different emphases.
There'll be overlap.
In terms of foreign policy, they're all global hegemons. Of one flavor or another. Right.
Right. There's not any objectivity anymore.
Right.
Okay. Let's move over to the Middle East just a little bit, because I was just thinking a little bit about the firing of Galant, and I'm wondering how the Israeli society is taking that. How does Israel feel like you're in the middle of this war that's not going well? You haven't defeated Hamas. You're bogged down in Lebanon. There's this imminent attack supposedly coming from Iran. And then in the middle of this, you get rid of your defense minister, the person that's responsible for defending your whole country. And then you put in this radical, we'll say, more of a radical Israel
with no military experience to speak of. Right.
Right. So just, it doesn't, if you're watching a football game and you pull your quarterback out in the middle of the game, there's usually a reason, right? Things aren't going well. So that's kind of what's happening here. So people are thinking, ooh, it's a sign that things aren't going well in Israel. And a lot of people, when talking to you, it seems like Israel had a lot of faith in the IDF, a lot of belief in the military, the power. Removing Golan surely has to be a sign that, well, maybe things aren't going so well on that front. So what's your take on this?
Actually, I don't think, there have been a lot of protests and some very, very large and quite intense protests. There's no question about it, and they're continuing. But it's not. I don't believe it's about what the problems that you pointed to. In fact, Israeli society in general seems to think that the war is going quite well. It seems rather amazing to us because, again, we've gone beyond the propaganda. But remember, like this recent attack by Israel is still being touted as a great success within Israel and then, of course, within the U.S. because they're just getting Israeli sources, that they just completely smashed up Iran's air defenses and their capabilities for producing more rockets. And it seems like, by and large, the Israeli public believes in that. And they seem to be actually on some sort of feel like they're on a roll. They assassinated all these people. They're, I'm sure there, some things are seeping in from like the Lebanese front, where clearly things on the ground are not going well. But there is a lot of censorship in Israel, In general, it's a very kind of freewheeling and actually very democratic kind of society. But the military censors have been given a lot of power during the current conflict. And so there's a lot that they don't see. And in general, the mood about the war seems to be very positive within Israel. So the protests are not about the war going bad, going the wrong way. I think, again, it's directed against Netanyahu personally. What a lot of people really hate within Israel. It's not so much not because he's conducted this genocidal war against Gaza, or he's bombing Lebanon or attempting a ground invasion of Lebanon. It's not because of that. It's a lot of things that actually preceded the war. There were some very, very large scale protests prior to October 7th. And in fact, at that time, people were saying that, boy, Israel's on the verge of a civil war. There was just a lot of anger about Netanyahu and the direction he was taking the country in. You know, in particular, he was attempting to reform the judiciary and make it less independent and really kind of more under his control. And a lot of Israelis, especially secular Israelis, were very angry about that. And so they continue to be angry. They continue to hate the man for those reasons. And then there's the hostage issue, which has not gone away. There have been a lot of people, especially, of course, family members, relations to the hostages who have been going out and protesting every day. And they have a lot of support within society. They say, bring the hostages home. And clearly, that is not a priority for Netanyahu. He really doesn't give a damn about the hostages. He pretends that he does, but I think most of Israeli society knows that he doesn't. And they're angry about that. And they know that Gallant was one of the people who was trying to get the hostages home. And that now that he's got rid of Gallant, there's really no chance. I think that's what the protests are about.
I find it hard to believe that there aren't more Israelis that are worried about the way the war is going. I mean, this has been going on for over a year.
Yeah.
Surely this wasn't the plan. And like
Right.
you said, they saw missiles from Iran striking Israel, hundreds.
Right.
Lining
Well, a lot
up
of
the
them
sky.
didn't. You have to remember, it's like in the air base out in the Negev Desert. That's out in the Negev Desert. So, like a lot of those videos that we saw were actually taken by Palestinians,
Bedouins.
by Bedouins. Yeah, who and not by Israelis. So some Israelis witnesses, I know that they did, but they only witnessed a part of it, a small part of it. Of course, there was that strike in Tel Aviv that people have to be aware of. But
Yeah. I mean, we
but
saw
it was
some
a fairly
videos
limited
of.
strike within Tel Aviv. I think it's so there's still. It seems rather incredible, but I find it incredible that there's so many people, highly educated people in this country that don't have any understanding of what's going on. Like, for example, in Ukraine, it's very easy to become comfortable within a bubble. And, and that bubble that will tell you the way things are, and they'll occasionally mention that there are some bad people out there who are saying these other things, but don't pay any attention to them for these reasons. And so they don't. They really, people can be very, very comfortable within a certain, information bubble. And I think that's what's happening in Israel. So clearly there are some people who understand what at least 500,000 Jewish Israelis have left Israel. And yeah, they are worried. And there's probably at least another 500,000 that are probably packing their bags now in preparation for leaving Israel. But most of them, again, are under the illusion that things are going real well. They're on a roll. Netanyahu's done great in decapitating Hezbollah, and they basically rendered Iran's air defenses useless. They've neutered the Iranian threat, and they're thinking that. Now, the Iranians say that they're going to launch a really massive attack, and they may do something this time that just cannot be hidden.
Right,
The
that's
last
what
one they could hide like 90% of it. Again, there's out in air bases. Most people aren't close to the air bases, but if it's like within Tel Aviv or something where where everybody's going to see it and experience, that may change things. But we're not there yet.
But I mean, the last one. I mean, I was watching on CNN and Fox. You could see. I mean, I think it was over Tel Aviv. Missiles going by and interceptors failing. I don't think it was that hidden. I think the Israeli population had to see it.
Well, yeah, they had to, but I mean, there weren't, the impacts, with the exception of, I think that one or two right there in Tel Aviv, they didn't happen until they saw these things overhead. And then you can get this interpretation, oh, our interceptors worked very well. They probably think, oh, really? It kind of didn't look like it, but they say so, Again, they're not really seeing the devastation. It's only like those Bedouins out in the desert saw those coming down one after another, bam, 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 bam. They knew what was going on. But most Israelis, Jewish Israelis, don't, or they don't want to. They don't want to really think about it too hard.
So most Israelis are still confident in their ability.
That's what I hear. I think Alistair Crook describes it as a kind of euphoria, which is incredible. There's just a sense that, man, we're on a roll. So those assassinations were extremely popular in Israel. I found the whole thing horrifying, and I think most of the world did. But they were very popular in Israel and gave Netanyahu a huge boost.
Well, that hubris is really going to be their downfall. That is,
Yeah,
they continue because I guess it's probably that's why Gallant was pushed out because Gallant was probably telling Netanyahu, "Hey, I'm not euphoric about this situation. It's
right.
not good."
Well, that could
And
be true, and it
Gallant,
also could be it's just that Netanyahu felt empowered. He's seen his poll numbers go way up, and said he was kind of reluctant because he knew, we're seeing the protests. He knew that there was a lot of support for Gallant out there, and so he was reluctant to get rid of him. I think he's always hated him. He's always considered him a thorn in his side. He's always considered him, kind of a an obstacle to his plans because he was always the voice of caution. So he always wanted to get rid of him, but he was reluctant to do so. But actually, the recent spate of assassinations have strengthened Netanyahu's position, and it may be that he felt like he was strong enough to get rid of him. He said, "Yeah, sure, there'll be protests, but they'll fade away, and I'll remain in charge. I can do it now."
it's kind of amazing how I was just on pins and needles for so long about this Iranian retaliation. And then the election happened, and now it's just kind of faded away. It's not on my
Yeah,
mind, but it's still coming, right? I mean,
yeah,
you
it'll
believe
happen. Yeah,
so you're positive that it's going
yeah.
to happen because part of me also is just thinking if things aren't going well for Israel, then maybe Iran would just let it play out. But it sounds like
Yeah, well, I think
Israelis
they
don't
see
think
that
so. So
right. What the Iranians want to establish real deterrence, and they feel like they haven't done it yet. Like the Israelis still haven't gotten the message. And I
clearly,
think,
from what you told me,
yeah, right. So I think that's why, and maybe this time it'll be something that cannot be hidden.
okay, well, I won't ask you when you think it's going to
I
happen
have
or
no
what's
idea. I think it'll
anyway.
be
So
fairly soon. I would say the odds are very high that it'll be within the next 2 weeks.
okay. All right, well, we'll see. I mean, one last thing, I saw a Wall Street Journal headline that Trump is to renew maximum pressure campaign against Iran. That he's wanting to go full on super sanctions, which sanctions
But
just
I don't
don't
think they
work. I
could
don't
do
understand
anything
why.
more. It's like they've already, I don't think there's, yeah,
So do you think?
unfortunately, Trump has always had a bee in his bonnet about Iran. And so that's a reason to be worried. If anything, he'll be even more supportive of Netanyahu's plans against Iran. I don't think, again, like the Pentagon will tell him, yeah, great, you hate Iran, but we just don't have the capabilities to carry out a meaningful attack on Iran. I think that's what they're going to tell him. And maybe he'll listen to it. We'll see. But yeah, he's always had a bee in his bonnet about Iran, going way back to 2016 and earlier. That was one thing that always disturbed me about him. He said good things about Russia, but I don't know where it comes from. But he shares this visceral hatred of Iran that not so much. I don't think he has it for Iranian people, but for the government. I don't know where it comes from, but it's there. It's part of his emotional makeup.
So do you think the Trump presidency will change the calculation at all for Iran on how they deal with Israel? Do they feel like maybe they gotta wrap this thing up more quickly? Trump also told Netanyahu, "I want this war done by the
Yeah.
time I enter office." I
Yeah,
mean,
and he was also going to solve the Ukraine war in 24 hours, and he says all kinds of things. I just, so I don't think there's going to be any difference. But if anything, maybe I think clearly the U.S. government has been trying to urge restraint on Israel, vis-a-vis Iran, without success. Israel just ignores them. Maybe they won't even make much of an effort to do that under Trump. But I don't think that really changes anything. I mean, Israel is going to go after Iran in any case, but also Israel doesn't really have the capabilities to do it. Neither do we. And whatever Trump may think, those realities will remain. There's really nothing he can change there.
right. Yeah, Israel really is in such a pickle. Sometimes I think, okay, well, maybe can we negotiate, get Israel to stop and restrain itself? But like you said, Israel's gone too far that I don't think it can stop. Like you said, if it stops now, it's just you committed half a genocide.
Yeah.
Everybody hates you. A million people have left, and you're a loser. You destroyed your country. The economy's in tatters. So there's there really is no way out for Israel here, right? I mean, it doesn't.
Yeah, well, no matter what, of course, if they stop now, they would be better off than if they continue with it. But they clearly have made themselves worse off. There's no question. If they stop now, you'll find Israel's position within the world, its economy, all the things that you mentioned, are going to be worse than they were prior to October 7th. And the fact is, like again, when the dust settles and the Israelis themselves look around, they'll realize that at some point. You just can't hide that fact.
Okay, Dan. Well, I think we'll end it there then.
Okay.
All right. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
Bye bye.
Bye.